happy to have you back today. So thank you for coming, and we hope the course is going well for you. Today, in terms of our presenters, we'll have me, Maria Genoviak, as one of the people talking about step 3, and I'm also going to let Kristen introduce herself today.
Hi everyone, glad to be here with all of you. I've talked to a few folks on the phone about projects so far, but otherwise haven't been here for a lecture yet. So I'm helping out Maria today and excited to be part of the course.
Great, and we also have Maddie and Danielle standing by, helping with chat and other things that might be coming up. So feel free, if you have any questions about the course, you can dump them in there. They might be able to answer them over chat, and then we will also have some time at the end of today's session to do any troubleshooting if you need it. In terms of what we have planned today, we'll be talking about step 3 of the Adaptation Workbook and introducing it. The nice thing is step 3 is pretty straightforward, and so it gives you some time to kind of catch up on your projects and be thinking about climate change impacts a little bit more before we move on to the adaptation actions in the next step. So we'll talk about step 3, and then we'll set up the assignment and homework for next week, or really the week after. In terms of step 3, so the way we do this, as you know by now, we go through week by week through the Adaptation Workbook. The first week was really focused on setting up your project and defining where you were working, your management objectives and goals for your project area. Last week in step 2, we really focused on what are the climate change impacts that are most important to your site. And then in step 3, what we really do is we bring the two of those together and think about how do those climate change impacts affect your management goals and objectives. And think about how does that affect, just your ability to meet those goals and objectives. So we foreshadowed this a little bit last week to try and keep you from jumping too far ahead, that step 2 and step 3 both deal with climate change, but they deal with different parts of it. So step 2, you're really describing how climate change may affect your site, and really talking about those site characteristics that can relate to vulnerabilities. So step 2 is really about place and how do regional climate change impacts affect your particular place using your experience and knowledge of a particular site. Step 3 today, we'll be talking about, has builds on that, but it's different. And so really then we're taking it a step further and thinking about how does climate change affect your ability to meet your management goals and objectives, and really kind of take that step back. And so I know sometimes people feel like, the course gets off, it feels a little slow because you want to jump right to actions, but this really provides us between step 2, thinking about your site, and step 3, thinking about your goals and objectives. It really gives us the ability to kind of pan out, zoom out, and really think about how climate change is going to affect your entire project, and gives us a really good foundation then for moving into adaptation actions, which we'll do after the course break. So the key questions that we ask in step 3 is what management challenges and opportunities might occur as a result of climate change. Can our current management meet our management goals and objectives? Or do our management goals and objectives need to change given what we know about climate change? So it's a good chance, like I said, to kind of step back and think about, this idea of what you've had coming forward with your project. Does it make sense given climate change? So now what I'll do is I'll walk through the different elements that you fill out in step 3 as part of the Adaptation Workbook. And again, they're pretty straightforward. The first one is thinking about the challenges to meeting your management objective with climate change. And so this is really simple. It's just the things that are going to make it harder to do what you wanted to do, climate change. So here again, because we're doing the adaptation workbook, we're focusing on climate change. And so we're not talking about every challenge in the world. We're not talking about, the markets for particular products or policies or funding. We will have a chance for you to capture some of those. There are definitely a lot of challenges to conservation, to management, to stewardship. But here we're really trying to focus on those pieces of how does climate change make it potentially harder to do our work. And so there's a couple examples here. I'm actually going to focus on, today I'm going to focus on that one on the bottom. So let's say that we had a management objective that was focused on maintaining and developing new walking trails, within a nature area or some sort of project area that we might have. We might have identified a climate change impact of, extreme precipitation in step 2. And in step 3, we're really thinking about, well, that extreme precipitation that my site is vulnerable to increases the damage from erosion and causes substantially greater costs for trail maintenance and hazard tree removal. And so that's kind of taking that impact again one step farther. Then we think about opportunities. So again, opportunities, just the flip side. So this is the things that might make it easier to achieve our management goal as a result of climate change. And again, we're focusing on that climate change part, not, everything in the world. And so again, really is trying to think about, are there ways sometimes, climate change actually makes it easier to restore certain kinds of, or manage certain types of ecosystems. Sometimes there's sort of silver linings that we can find. In this example, again, we're just kind of building out the step 3 table. You'll be doing it in the online workbook, but if we're really focused on maintaining existing and developing new walking trails, we might, identify that, well, if the seasons, kind of the spring season advances, and that means that the trails might dry out earlier in the growing season. And so we might actually get a longer season of use. Our recreation season for these hiking trails might increase. So that's good because we can provide that recreational benefit. Maybe there's also kind of a downside of, use-related impacts, but, overall, we could see this as being a really good thing in that terms of those trails being more usable if they're not damaged. So essentially, we're cataloging for each of our objectives that we identified in step 1. We're cataloging what are, what are the different challenges and opportunities, and effectively trying to weigh out, what does that mean in terms of our ability to meet our management goals and objectives. So we list the challenges, we list the objectives, or excuse me, we list the challenges, we list the opportunities. And then we, looking at all of those, think about for each objective, what is the feasibility of meeting each management objective given our current management actions. And so, current management can be a little bit fuzzy, but, the idea is thinking about, if you weren't thinking about climate change, or if you can make a certain amount of reasonable assumptions about the future, does climate change make, it easier or harder for you? So high feasibility is, hey, we can do it. Our opportunities outweigh our challenges, or maybe there are very few challenges. Moderate is that, teeter-totter being kind of even. There are some challenges, there are some opportunities, and so, we're somewhere in the middle. And then low is, that there's significant challenges, and that, you really need more resources or effort to be able to continue meet your management objectives. Your current management or your current approach is probably not going to be enough. And so, that kind of starts to suggest you're either going to need to change your goal or objective, or you're going to have to put in more effort. Okay, so a lot of times, these are kind of fuzzy, but, I think people can usually get a sense of where we're at, and it gives us a good gut check on our goals and objectives. So here, looking at the bottom one on the table, maybe those impacts from extreme precipitation and the costs of tree maintenance and of trail maintenance and hazard tree removal are just humongous. Imagine those are really expensive costs to maybe a small or resource-starved organization. And so, they're not really getting any benefit. They're getting more use of the trails, but they're not getting anything that's like good for the trails out of it. It's just a lot of damage and impact. And so they might identify that, given their current budget and maybe the fact that they're not doing a lot of maintenance, that there's a low feasibility of being able to maintain existing trails or develop new ones, given their current management resources. So this is where, again, the point of step 3 is to give you a gut check and identify, well, really allow you to ask the question, are you going to continue with your management objectives? Okay, so, it gives you a chance to just think about it and ask the question. So, again, if they're high, it's not a big deal, but if they're low, you have to consider that. And so you can either do this 2 ways. One is you can go back and essentially decide at this point, I'm going to change this objective. And so what you would essentially do is you would go back in the workbook and revise it in step 1. And so you'd say, okay, maybe I can maintain the trails, but I can't make new ones. So I'd go back to step 1 and say, okay, I'm going to focus on maintaining the trails, but I'm going to revise this goal of this objective, but I'm not going to necessarily expand it because I just can't. I don't expect to have the resources. That might be an example. So you'd go back to step 1 in the workbook, revise your objective. You might make a note that you did that, probably be a good thing to do. And then it would just be updated in the workbook and you'd come back to step 3. So that's one option. The other option is you recognize that that's a low feasibility objective and you continue, but you just recognize that you're under more challenges. So, excuse me. So an example might be like, let's say that you had an objective that was really focused on maintaining a rare ecosystem or a rare species. And that species, let's say, was really vulnerable to climate change. You might recognize, hey, my objective to maintain this species has low feasibility, but it might be really important to you as an organization, or it might be the best chance of success. And so you wouldn't want to change your objective. You want to proceed with it, but you go into it eyes open, knowing that you have kind of more work to do. Okay. And we can talk about this more if you have any questions. The last part in step 3 is that there's an option. There's a place where you can put in other considerations. And so these are those social or financial or other factors that affect your ability to meet your objectives. And so this is sort of like sort of like an open opportunity to make, kind of record all those things that have to do with your goal or objective, document them, that don't have to do with climate change. So, for example, using again this bottom version is, noting that the gap in being able to achieve this objective is really related to funding. So you might say, like, yeah, the reason this is low feasibility is all funding. So you're documenting that. Or you might have, again, might be noting that, I want to, do this, but maybe like a policy needs to change, or there's some other factor. More education or communication would really be needed to be able to achieve this outcome. Those are some examples of things you might collect in other considerations, because those challenges and those opportunities are really supposed to be about climate change. So those are the items that go into step 3. They are, again, I think they're pretty straightforward in terms of being able to understand what they are. And this is really that gut check of being able to evaluate your goals and objectives. Again, just a couple key points. Those challenges and opportunities should relate to climate change, and the other considerations field section is for those other pieces. So often it's policies, budgets, or public engagement. Again, step 3 can sometimes feel a little bit redundant, especially if you maybe kind of did a really rigorous job in step 2 and kind of got a little ahead of yourself. That happens, but just again, keep that in mind that step 2 focuses on the site, step 3 focuses on the objectives. And then also another thing that happens is the opportunities very quickly turn into, especially tend to turn into adaptation actions. That's a little bit fine, because if you have an opportunity, often it tells you what action to take. So a certain amount of that is probably likely to happen, but just be aware of that, and remember that we're really going to be focusing on adaptation strategies in the next step. And that's when we're going to really cut you guys loose to be able to come up with, all the actions in your adaptation plan. So I'm going to pause there. If you have any questions about that, please chat them in. I'm going to turn it over to Kristen to give an example, and then again, we'll be able to do Q&A at the end of the lecture. Thanks.
Excellent. Let me get my slides up here, but definitely pipe up with any questions if you have them while I get situated here. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share then. Okay. Yeah, so hello again, everybody. As Maria mentioned, you're probably wondering at this point in the course how all of these different threads and these different steps actually come together in a final adaptation project. Hopefully week after week, you're starting to see how all of these pieces build on one another, but we wanted to take this opportunity, this being a relatively shorter lecture and a somewhat shorter step, to run through an example of a project that has been through this process that has used the Adaptation Workbook. And so in this case, I selected a project in Michigan. I know there's lots of other Michiganders and Midwesterners on this call today. This was an adaptation demonstration that we did with the Land Conservancy of West Michigan. And it was on a preserve that was kind of this mix of bog and prairie and forested habitat. So that's just a little bit of background as to what we're looking at here. So as I mentioned, this was a land trust, the Land Conservancy, that owned this parcel. So their goals were pretty aligned with other types of land trust goals that you may be familiar with or may have seen. Really, the reason this property was purchased in the first place, it was because it was this unique bog habitat. So their main goal was to preserve the flora, the diverse mix of native species that were present on that site. And do a little bit of prairie restoration on that property. So some of their more specific objectives around that, they had some specific goals around maintaining the native FQI value for that bog and hardwood swamp area. They wanted to keep the abundance of exotic species at less than 1% cover. And they also had some goals related to expanding the prairie habitat. So they wanted to actually do some prairie restoration, expand that habitat by 1 acre per year. So again, pretty straightforward goals and objectives here. As Maria mentioned, that step 2, the climate change impacts, really focuses on the site. So this is when they sat down and thought about, regional climate change impacts and how those were going to affect this Salt Lake Bog site. So some of the things that they came up with, they were a bit concerned about changing precipitation patterns, and particularly these drier summers that they're expecting in this part of Michigan. So, obviously this is a wetland habitat, this is a bog. They thought that could have a detrimental impact. They also have nearby this property a couple different farms, potential nutrient sources, and so expecting intense heavy precipitation along with kind of having that surrounding landscape was a concern to them for nutrient runoff issues. They were also starting off with pretty low prairie diversity. prairie plant diversity. Prairie restoration was one of their goals, so they kind of had a little bit of remnant habitat. They'd done some volunteer-based restoration and seed collection, but they were starting off with fairly low diversity in that respect. And then they were afraid that climate changes could maybe amplify some of the problems they were already experiencing with invasive species. That's step 3. They really brought this back around to their management goals and objectives. So as you recall, most of their management goals were focused around maintaining this native plant diversity, right? So they were looking at potential climate-related challenges to that. So again, the summer drying that they were worried about, they knew that could directly affect certain species like sphagnum in the bog areas. So they were worried about that. That reducing bog plant diversity in that respect. They were also worried about runoff from those nearby farms affecting acidity and nutrients in the bog, and then that impacting this native plant diversity on site. They were worried about changing precipitation patterns and how that might limit the periods of prescribed burning they could conduct in the prairie areas, which again is vital to maintaining that native plant diversity. And then they were also worried about droughty conditions enhancing the spread of the lovely spotted knapweed in that area. But they did identify a few climate-related opportunities. So, they thought that, oops, sorry, advanced too soon there. They thought that climate changes could allow an opportunity for some more southern species, southern bog species to expand into the area, and that could help boost that native plant diversity, could help maintain it in spite of some of these challenges. And they also expected hotter, drier summers to benefit a lot of the prairie plant species that are native to the area. So after considering all of that, they decided on a feasibility for most of those management objectives of medium or moderate. So, some challenges, but also some opportunities. They thought that most of their goals and objectives were still pretty feasible. Obviously, as you guys will do, they went through each objective individually and thought about this. So this is a little bit of a summary of what they came up with, a summary of some of their key points. We haven't gotten to the point where we've talked about step 4 yet. So this is a little bit of an abbreviation and a preview to next week. But in step 4, the group really sat down and thought, okay, how can we address some of these climate challenges directly with our management actions? And so they developed a couple management actions related to these heavy rain events, like increasing their buffer area around the bog habitat to reduce that runoff. And maintaining and expanding forested buffers around some of the kettle ponds in the area. They also thought about these drier summers and some actions they might be able to take, like actually enhancing some of doing a little bit of topographical manipulation, I guess you could say, and doing some shallow excavation and enhancing areas that might stay wetter longer, really encouraging that mesic wetland mix of species. And then they wanted to really expand their crew of people who could help them with invasive control. In step 5, again, a little bit of a preview, you'll talk more about monitoring and different aspects of your project that you might monitor to make sure your adaptation actions are doing what you want them to do. And so in this case, they picked out a few. They picked out the level of water in the bog, water quality, plant diversity and composition, and the percentage of invasive species to monitor to make sure their management actions were having the desired effect. So it's a little bit of a run through an adaptation project. And hopefully that got at some of the distinction between steps 2 and 3. I want to pause there and just see if there are any questions. I see a lot of chats coming in, but haven't really been monitoring them. So if there's anything that came up, Danielle or Maria, that we should answer here, let me know.
Yeah, Maria. Oh, go ahead, Maria. I was going to say there's been some good discussion about, yeah, agriculture and some of the other questions in the chat, but I don't think I wasn't going to bring any forward. I don't know if you were, Danielle.
I was just going to remind folks that we did learn a lot about quite a few different vulnerability assessments in the last session and in the optional session. So if you want to return to any of those to remind yourself of some of those tools, that can be helpful when you're evaluating, how you respond to climate change in your management in step 3. If you have direct questions about agriculture, feel free just to email us and we can try to hook you up with a much more robust set of resources than we've provided in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. I see some questions and some chatter coming in too, just about cross-boundary landowner coordination. So that is a huge issue and looks very different depending on where you're working and how big the property you're working on is. In this particular Michigan example, I think this land conservancy is a pretty good working relationship with property owners in the area, and pretty good history of working with those folks on management. But to answer your question about what stage in climate planning is it best to get together with those folks, that varies a lot, really, depending on the situation. I know some people like to involve those folks from the beginning. In this case, with the Land Conservancy of West Michigan, a lot of the work they were doing, they were kind of formulating these climate change plans and then going back and gut checking that with some of their property holders and some of their constituents in their area. So they kind of had the story lined up about how they wanted to tackle climate change, and then took a time to pause and kind of go through that with people and get feedback. So it does kind of depend a little bit. And I see a lot of prairie specific questions coming in, which I think we can tackle maybe in the comments. Excellent. Okay, let's see. I see one related specifically to step 3. So Kristen said, step 3, we are reevaluating our objectives for feasibility based on our step 2 work, but just to clarify, we are not rewriting to directly relate to climate change impacts. Yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that's right. So you want to take those impacts that you thought about for step 2 and think about how those apply to your management goals or objectives. The only reason you would go back and rewrite is if you look and you're like, you know what, yeah, that objective is really just not feasible. It was a little bit ambitious. I really think we should go back and, in the example Maria gave, not worry about new trails, just worry about maintaining the ones we have. So that's the only real reason you would rewrite.
Yeah, I would, if I could just add on to that, because I mean, it's very rare. We want to make people aware, like, if you need to change your goals and objectives, go back and do it. But it's very rare that people actually do. Usually it's more that, oh, I realize this objective has lower, moderate, or lower feasibility, and then they go into the adaptation steps with that in mind, thinking about, okay, that just means I'm going to have to work harder on the adaptation side of things. So that's part of it. And then the other part is, if you did a really robust, job in step 2 of thinking about your climate change impacts, and you hit step 3 and you feel like you're repeating yourself, don't, do that. Really just do focus on that feasibility element. And to the extent you feel like you've already written a lot of that challenges and opportunities, you can either just briefly summarize it, or, just kind of briefly summarize it and get to the feasibility. And that will depend, again, on kind of how detailed you were in step 2.
Awesome. Thanks for the great questions, everybody. Appreciate that. So just a few final things to round out the class here. A few notices for what is coming up, and as usual, some pro tips for actually working with the online workbook for this step. So a few things, I think we kind of covered this, but challenges and opportunities are listed, or at least the default in the workbook is to list them for each objective. So you can, if you have a lot of objectives, it might get a little tedious. That's why we try to limit that off the bat. At least most of the projects I've looked at, people have a pretty reasonable amount of objectives. So these shouldn't be too hard to go through. I think the next screen will show this in a little bit more clarity, but basically there's like a temptation to add a lot of challenges to one challenge box. Really, your workbook will turn out neater if you click on Add Challenge and add each separate challenge to its own box. And the next screen will show what that actually looks like here. And then as we mentioned, if you need to reconsider your management goals and objectives, if you decide that feasibility is low and you do want to tweak things, you can go back and change those objectives in step 1, and the adaptation workbook will save those changes all the way throughout. So just going back to step 1 and making those edits will be enough. And as always, there is the tutorial PDF that you have for this course to go back to with any detailed questions, or also the recorded tutorials within the adaptation workbook. So this is what I was referring to earlier. For each objective that you see listed at the top here, you'll get a box for challenges, a box for opportunities. If you have several challenges that you want to add, go ahead and click that orange Add Challenge button, so you don't just get, a lot of big giant paragraph in your final plan spit out here. This looks like a long list for next time, but the good thing is we do not have a lecture or any assignments due next week. So your next things due will be 2 weeks from now. And what you're going to want to do before that Monday, February 22nd class is finish any items from step 2 and go ahead and complete step 3. There's a little homework again in the adaptation workbook following step 3. And if you haven't heard from your instructor, or you haven't set up a time to check in with them, maybe just send a note, particularly if you want that time. If you're feeling stuck on something or have a few hanging questions and you just want the opportunity to check in with them. This is kind of optional for you to work out with your instructor depending on how things are going, but we just like to take this time in the 3rd week of the course to make sure folks are feeling pretty comfortable with their project and the workbook. And then Danielle, in the next newsletter that comes out in the next mailing on this course, she'll include a link to a video that covers adaptation strategies and approaches, and that'll be a good preview or good intro to the next course, or I'm sorry, the next lecture. Looking ahead, there is a discussion session this week, so you will have that either Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on what day you are assigned to. That will be the same as it was the first week. And that discussion will be focusing mainly on step 2. So climate change impacts to your site vulnerability. We might go into step 3 a little bit, but recognizing that folks haven't really had much time to look at that. So that is what to be thinking about over these next couple of weeks here. This is a little ways down the road, but I did want to point out that there will be one more special session. So again, this is optional, just like the one on the Climate Change Atlas. This will be a little bit more of an introduction to the climate change adaptation strategies and approaches menus. There are many different menus out there at this point, and so if you've been struggling thinking about which one am I going to use or what's the difference between all of these, this might be a good session to attend just to get a little bit more clarity on that. If you're sure you want to use the forest menu, you looked at it already and you're set on that, then you're probably good and you may not need to attend this session. The session will be in the same course Zoom room that you've been using this whole time. And I believe, Danielle, you're going to send out a calendar invite to that. Is that right?
Yeah, several folks haven't or didn't receive them, so I apologize to anyone who gets another one, redundant calendar appointment, but I'm just going to send it out to the whole class after this call.
Okay, great. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that calendar invite from Danielle. But that will be February 23rd, which is a Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then again, so next lecture will be Monday, February 22nd. You have a free catch-up week next week. So this is a great time to kind of get everything 3-step. And then a discussion session will be tomorrow and Wednesday, really talking about step 2 and a little bit of step 3. Okay, enjoy your free week. Did any questions come in that you guys want to answer, Maria and Danielle?